Thank you for joining me today on this edition of Trends and Directions. My name is Paul Teese and I'm your host. And today we're going to be discussing the role and future of hydrogen and the potential it has to play in the decarbonization and sustainable future in Australia. Jacobs and Yarra Valley Water recently teamed up to deliver a thought leadership paper which asks, what if the growth of Australia's hydrogen industry could be supported by co-located hydrogen production at wastewater treatment plants? We're going to unpack that. There's a lot of information to look at, but it's really exciting stuff. And with me today, we have Simon Prunster. He's the Energy and Emissions Specialist at Yarra Valley Water. Michelle Freund, Senior Economist at Jacobs, and Henry Swisher, Energy Markets Consultant at Jacobs. So thank you all very much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our discussion. So like I said, you recently published a thought leadership paper on the role of water utilities in hydrogen production. And so to kind of set the table for us, I'm going to turn to Henry first. I'm going to ask, especially for listeners who are new to this topic, and I'll admit I was one, can you explain in simple terms, what hydrogen is, what are its advantages, what it can be used for, and why it's being talked about so much in Australia?
Yeah, and thanks for having me on today, Paul. That's a good place to start. And before I explain what hydrogen is, it might help to actually start with what it isn't, because there are actually a lot of misconceptions about that. So hydrogen is often perceived as a fuel or energy source like gasoline or natural gas, but actually hydrogen is a form of energy storage and falls into the same category as batteries. So this means that it doesn't create energy itself. It just allows it to be moved around and stored and used at another time. So interest in energy storage solutions like hydrogen and batteries have been on the rise because of this growing need to tackle climate change and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, and that's through reliance on renewable energy sources like wind and solar.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So how can you use that energy when you need it? And addressing that availability issue is why energy storage solutions like hydrogen and like batteries are going to be really important as we transition towards a zero emissions electricity system. So in as far as advantages go, because hydrogen is a lightweight gas, one of the major upsides is that it can be used in all sorts of different applications and end uses that other types of energy storage won't necessarily be able to address. One example is that because it is so lightweight, it's a good option for use in, say, heavyweight transport vehicles. And that's something where batteries aren't as necessarily as good of a use for. Another really good example is actually as a use in, you can use it in existing natural gas networks. And that's definitely something you can't use with a battery.
Mm-hmm.
So on the other hand, I don't want to slam batteries too much because they actually do make more efficient use of energy and they don't require as much supporting infrastructure, which makes them great for passenger vehicles, like those we've seen from Tesla and Nissan.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really a case of, one is better than the other, like batteries are better than hydrogen or vice versa. They're just have very different characteristics and they can actually be complementary a lot of the time. So you also asked why it's being talked about so much in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
One of the main reasons comes back to the fact that it can be used in lots of different ways. So that's been highlighted as a way to decarbonize a big range of some of our most emissions intensive sectors by leveraging off of the cost reductions that we've seen in renewable energy recently.
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that it actually can play a decarbonizing role has grown from another misconception, which I think is also worth addressing, and that stems from how hydrogen is actually produced. So there's this common perception that all hydrogen is zero emissions, right? But because it's a form of energy storage, like I said earlier, that energy has to come from somewhere. And that hasn't traditionally been from renewables. So these different ways of using energy to produce hydrogen are important in whether or not it can be considered zero emissions and whether it can actually play that decarbonizing role or not.
Mm-hmm.
And the easiest way to think about this is actually in the terms of different colors of hydrogen. So you may have heard people refer to, say, brown or blue or green hydrogen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
what does that mean? Why are there different colors of hydrogen?
yeah, so it basically refers to the different types of energy used to produce hydrogen and the actual emissions that each process creates.
Mm-hmm.
So because brown hydrogen, so brown hydrogen is what you would expect. It uses fossil fuels like coal or natural gas, and it actually does create emissions. Whereas blue hydrogen is the same exact process, but those emissions are captured and stored, meaning that it's actually technically carbon neutral. Um, and when you get all the way to the other end of the spectrum at green hydrogen, that's produced basically from renewable energy, so it doesn't actually create any emissions in the first place. Another important bit that I want to talk about is building on that idea of green hydrogen. We released a paper last year, Jacob's first hydrogen paper, where we coined the term sustainable hydrogen. And I know that's not a color, so maybe we could have been a little bit more creative with the name. But the point we wanted to get across with it is it wasn't just the focus on the energy source, but also the water source. So that's the second important point, is that water is also a major input to hydrogen production. But until recently, it really hasn't been a major focus of industry conversations. But with this changing climatic conditions in Australia, we've had the drought, we've had the really bad bushfires recently and historically. Water really is a precious resource here. So we shouldn't be creating another water-reliant industry when we have sustainable options like recycled water from wastewater treatment plants. So I don't want to hijack the whole interview.
Right.
I'll finish off by coming back to what's driving interest in hydrogen in Australia beyond these sustainability aspects. And as a country, we do have really excellent renewable energy resources, and because of our proximity to Asia, hydrogen could represent a new export product to markets such as Japan, Singapore, and the Republic of South Korea. Yeah, so for this vision to be successful, though, it's likely that we will also need a strong domestic market here. But cost is currently a major barrier to this opportunity actually materializing. So that's what the industry is really focused on right now, is how do we bring down the costs and stimulate uptake of hydrogen in different sectors. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's great. That really sets the table for us. And so, turning to our economist, talking about the cost barriers to leveraging hydrogen production in Australia, and how it might be useful in a sustainable future. Let's turn to Michelle. And so Michelle, obviously, part of the genesis of our call today is to discuss the paper that Yarra Valley and Jacobs recently published. And can you tell me a bit about what you looked at and what you found?
Thanks, Paul. Well, that's a big question. So maybe I will be hijacking the conversation. We'll see how we go.
Okay.
I'll do my best to get through it quickly. But building on what Henry said, the hydrogen market internationally and domestically is still emerging. And as you said, there are challenges to its widespread commercialisation. Recently, the Australian government identified that hydrogen would need to be priced at around $2 per kilogram for it to compete with alternative energy sources for broader applications, which include transport. The range is more between $4 and $6 per kilogram. However, until demand increases to a point that supports enough production to achieve economies of scale that's needed to drive down costs, these competitive prices can't be reached, and domestic demand won't increase. So you see, we find ourselves in what we refer to in our paper as that chicken or egg dilemma. How do we reduce prices to generate demand and guarantee that demand when we need to increase demand to reduce price? Our paper focused on whether water utilities could play a role in helping reduce the price of hydrogen and to support the acceleration of the hydrogen industry. So as Henry alluded to, in the past, discussions regarding the role of the water sector has been limited to the importance of supplying recycled water as a sustainable input to electrolysis. But we took it a step further and asked the question, what if the growth of Australia's domestic hydrogen market could be supported by co-locating hydrogen production at the wastewater treatment plants? So Henry gave some background about what hydrogen is and how it's produced, but electrolysis does not only produce hydrogen. In fact, for every 1 kilogram of we say kilograms in Australia. For every kilogram of hydrogen produced, there's 8 kilograms of oxygen produced. We know that pure oxygen could be a valuable resource in its own right as part of the wastewater treatment process. So we really wanted to investigate that opportunity further. As part of our analysis, what we really wanted to do was see whether we could create this win-win situation where the wastewater treatment plant could benefit from buying pure oxygen from an on-site hydrogen plant, but where the hydrogen plant could also benefit from that guaranteed demand for the oxygen that is being produced. In effect, that demand would allow the price of hydrogen to be subsidised.
Okay.
So, I mean, we've got Simon on the call. So central to our approach was teaming up with Yarra Valley Water, Melbourne's largest water corporation, and the use of one of its wastewater treatment plants as a case study. The Aurora wastewater treatment plant, which is the one that we used as our case study, services a really fast-growing population and is due for a full replacement in the next few years, and then another major upgrade in 15 years' time. And the site ticks all boxes for a suitable location for hydrogen production. So firstly, it has access to land, it has access to recycled water, and thirdly, it has access to renewable energy generation on site from a waste to energy plant. So that would, help that sustainable production. We've got the recycled water and the renewable energy. Also, it's located in an urban area, so it's in close proximity to potential demand for the hydrogen itself, which is really important. So I guess we wanted to. It would help explain why the use of pure oxygen would be beneficial for a wastewater treatment plant.
Yeah, I was wondering
not obvious.
about that.
Currently, the plant relies on conventional aeration technologies. This basically involves pumping air bubbles into the treatment process to deliver oxygen to microorganisms. Look, I'm an economist. I'm not going to go into the technical details. There are plenty of people that know more about this than me. What I do know is that air is made up of only 20% oxygen. So pumping air to deliver oxygen is not the most efficient process, and it uses a lot of energy and requires a larger footprint for the wastewater treatment plant itself. Our analysis was quite straightforward. In the first instance, we tested whether adopting pure oxygen in the treatment process at the Aurora wastewater treatment plant could produce enough cost savings to justify transitioning to an oxygen-based technology. We then assessed whether the guaranteed demand for oxygen could support the commercialisation of a co-located hydrogen plant. So it sounds pretty simple. And the results were really promising. We identified an opportunity at Aurora to create that win-win situation we were after. We found that delivering oxygen to the treatment process was more efficient and reduced the capital and the operating costs at the site. At the same time, that guaranteed demand for oxygen meant that the price of hydrogen was subsidised, and the co-located facility could be commercially viable while selling hydrogen at that target price range I was referring to, that $2 to $6 per kilogram price range. Now, there are two main reasons why we're really excited about this. Firstly, in our case study, we found that even if only half the hydrogen produced is sold, the price could remain competitive. This is really important because the market, as we said, is still emerging and demand isn't guaranteed. Keeping the prices low will help stimulate further growth in the demand and address that chicken or egg dilemma we were talking about. And secondly, the ability to scale hydrogen production around a guaranteed demand for oxygen really reduces the risk to early entrance into the market and would hopefully encourage early investment in hydrogen production. This is really important if we are to accelerate the growth in the sector. So ultimately, the case study implied that the water sector could have a more pivotal role in accelerating the development of the hydrogen industry, and the results are extremely promising.
Oh, well, it's fascinating. The idea of co-locating a hydrogen production facility and a wastewater treatment plant, making use of, like you outlined, like the Aurora plant, all these conditions were favorable to that. And, it's really interesting to be able to take something that exists and like find a new and fascinating way to use that. And so, Simon, I have a question for you. This is really kind of an interesting departure from the quote unquote traditional role of water utilities. And so, you want to share with us a little bit about kind of what was driving Yarra Valley's interest, in this space, and then kind of looking, I guess, getting your crystal ball out, but looking kind of to the future. Do you see water utilities, becoming more and more energy providers?
Sure, thanks, Paul. Well, there's a couple of questions to unpack there, but first of all, about the drivers. I can talk generally about the water sector in Victoria. So the water sector makes up 24% of government emissions in Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
And so a few years ago, there was a drive where all the water corps came together, and we set to decarbonise the sector. And for regional water utilities, that means hitting net zero by 2050. But for the metros, which are the big ones, we're going to hit net zero by 2030. So we have to look at ways to find options that can basically reduce our carbon footprint, so that we contribute to the reduced rate of global warming. So what that means for us is that we've got a strong focus on renewable energy. We're looking to produce 100% of our own renewable energy by 2025, and that driving us and looking at all of our facilities, we started looking at what are the opportunities to produce energy at our facilities. And one that came along kind of in parallel to that was the emerging role of hydrogen could play in decarbonising the economy. So we were looking at what was happening in that space and starting to think about, is there a role for us in that space? And that was about the time that Jacobs released a white paper, and we started talking to them, and we had a few ideas and they had a few ideas, and hence this project was sort of born. I guess the way that we've thought about it is that we've flipped the equation. So we're not looking at producing hydrogen per se. We look at ourselves, and we're big consumers of oxygen. So we've thought to ourselves, is there a way that we could produce oxygen that's viable for us? We know that having pure oxygen increases the efficiency of our plants and can play a role in other parts of what we do. So we wanted to understand, is it viable for us to produce oxygen? And if you look at it in isolation, it's probably not. But if you look at it when you produce this byproduct of green hydrogen, we think that's got a pretty, big future, and that there's going to be a value that we can associate that. So we're almost subsidising the production of oxygen to make our plants more efficient, to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's where we started looking, and what we've discovered, as Michelle and Henry were alluding to, is that this symbiotic relationship between the two value streams and how they can interact and almost cross-subsidise each other. And that makes it viable on both fronts and presents a really good opportunity, especially when it's linked to the demand for oxygen at wastewater treatment plants, which can be quite significant. So I'm not saying that we're probably going to be industrial scale producers that would look to export internationally, but I'd say that we could supply a local domestic hydrogen hub and satisfy the demand there relatively easily. So what this means is that it gives us the opportunity to start thinking about producing hydrogen and oxygen at wastewater treatment plants that are located on the fringes of urban areas and that have routes for disposal of that hydrogen. So we've got reticulated natural gas networks nearby. We have transport infrastructure. So near our place, we've got bus companies that are looking to decarbonise. We're right next to the major freeway that connects Melbourne to Sydney. So long term, we could potentially play a role in decarbonising that transport route. There's a range of possibilities that we could go and explore. So we think we're really well placed to service what could be domestic hydrogen demand. And we think that we can subsidise the production of hydrogen through giving oxygen a value, which, as Michelle spoke of before brings us down to producing hydrogen in a range that's competitive for the market, with all the advantages of zero emissions. So, do I think that we could be, an energy producer of the future and play a role? Definitely. And I think that hopefully we can prove this concept through our project that we're conducting. And once we've proved the concept, it will become almost the blueprint for how you actually roll out newer forms of wastewater treatment plants across Australia, or when you look to upgrade what is conventional technology that is potentially 100 years old with newer technologies which are, support the hydrogen production. And the use case there is better than business as usual. So I really think it's a promising development, and something that I keep joking with the guys. I think it could change the world. So, looking to do.
Oh, it's fascinating. And, so you touched on something, and I'm going to ask you about this, Michelle, about the, oxygen and the role that it's played in the, reducing the cost of hydrogen, oxygen demand, and its role in reducing the cost of hydrogen. Why hasn't this been addressed before, do you think?
Well, Paul, that's a really good question, and one that the team we asked ourselves this over and over again as we wrote the paper. If the results are so promising, why hasn't this already been done? And there appear to be several reasons for this. Firstly, although conventional aeration treatment is not that efficient, in the past, pumping all this air through the treatment process was never seen as a problem, because electricity and land has been cheap in Australia. And this meant that these inefficiencies were widely adopted despite the inefficiency. Today, we're seeing the cost of electricity and land rise, and these inefficiencies are becoming more problematic. Secondly, as far as I understand, the efficiency of oxygen-based treatment has really improved in recent years, and that means that the costs are becoming a lot more competitive with conventional treatments. And lastly, we've also heard anecdotally that the price of oxygen supply at the quantities needed was a barrier to uptake. In our case study, relying on on-site production with a guaranteed supply at the treatment plant would address this problem. But the pros and cons of sourcing oxygen from an on-site hydrogen plant relative to sourcing it from another market provider was identified in our paper as something that really needs further consideration.
Okay. And then further on the topic of oxygen, Simon, does using oxygen have any additional benefits for water utilities?
Short answer is yes. The longer answer is we're looking in the paper at the role of oxygen in the treatment process. So that's delivering air to the microbes that break down the wastewater, and increasing the efficiency in the way that the oxygen is delivered to those. But there are also a lot of other benefits that we could use oxygen for. So if we take the oxygen and turn it into ozone, we can start using it as a disinfectant. That can displace chemicals in our disinfection processes, such as chlorine. We can also look to tackle the world of emerging contaminants in wastewater, so pharmaceuticals that are not traditionally being broken down in the conventional treatment process, so we can start to address those and those free radicals. So the oxygen is a really potent disinfectant, and that can help for when we provide either recycled Class A water, or alternatively, if we discharge to waterways, that we're providing that extra level of treatment that will benefit the environment. There's also, well, they're the main sort of benefits that we would use the oxygen for. But another one that we're looking at too is the potential for odor control. So we can use ozone in odor controls, which is better for our local communities. So where we have these assets or sewer pumping stations that are in urban environments that may emit some odours, that we can look to treat those a bit more effectively and safely, and without any harm and without using chemicals. And also at the inlets to our treatment plants, where we get there's a lot of things in sewer that shouldn't really be there, wet wipes, fats and oils that converge, and we have to screen those, and those screenings are not pleasant. So if there's a way that we can address the odour issues that come from there by using ozone, then that's a good thing for our local communities as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. Michelle, the paper, obviously it looked at one case study, but what are the opportunities for Australia more broadly?
You're right. Our focus was really just on the one case study, but we did learn a few things from our analysis that can help identify more opportunities. We found that adopting oxygen-based treatment at wastewater treatment plants offers greater cost savings when the plant is due for a major upgrade or replacement. So we know that those large replacements, have potential. We found we didn't look at all these extra uses of oxygen in as much detail, the ones that Simon has just gone through. But what these suggest is that there's more potential to use pure oxygen at wastewater treatment plants, which could help justify co-locating a hydrogen production plant even when there's a smaller upgrade involved. So overall, the results from our case study are promising enough to consider whether these benefits could be replicated across small, medium and larger wastewater treatment plant upgrades. Obviously, it's a site-specific consideration that requires technical and commercial feasibility to be considered. But the good news is that there are many wastewater treatment plants around Australia that are due for upgrades, and so some of these opportunities could exist in the short term. I can't specifically answer which ones exist.
But the opportunities are there, and so Henry,
definitely.
Like in purely speculative terms, what could this mean for Australia's hydrogen industry and Australia itself if this process was widely adopted, and what does it look like 5 or 10 years down the road?
So there's probably 2 points here. First off, that concept that our paper that Michelle explained really well and Simon's talked about, if that can be replicated across Australia, it could act as a catalyst to accelerate the development of the nation's hydrogen industry. So doing this at strategic locations like, for example, ports or logistics terminals or major transport corridors could really lay the foundations for developing large-scale supply chains. So you're creating enough hydrogen at a low enough cost to start building experience with how to use it in lots of different ways. And Simon mentioned buses near the Yarra Valley Water site. So for context, the amount of hydrogen produced from the facility in our study would be able to fuel about 50 buses. And that's probably enough to start developing infrastructure that is currently lacking, like refueling stations at a scale that will actually help eliminate barriers to future users. So that second aspect is also, over that 5-10 years, comes back to the decarbonization story. If we can enable faster uptake of sustainable hydrogen across different applications, the learnings created from allowing us to decarbonize these sectors more rapidly, and all these different sectors that have been quite hard to get rid of emissions from, all without compromising the nation's drinking resources, is a really interesting prospect. So when you think about the size of Australia and the transport routes connecting all of our different cities, that's a lot of emissions. Encouraging faster adoption of an environmentally sustainable replacement for all those fossil fuels that's also commercially viable would be a huge step towards achieving a zero emission society. And it doesn't have to stop at transport. Like I mentioned, if we can use innovative means like that concept explored in our paper to bring costs down, sustainable hydrogen has the potential to allow for so many of our major industries to cut their emissions, reduce their impact on climate change without negatively impacting economic growth. And I think that's a really exciting prospect.
Excellent. And, I think it's exciting too that, this is an opportunity for Australia really be at the tip of the spear, so to speak, in terms of an innovative solution, for sustainability. And so my last question for today is for you, Michelle, and it's, looking beyond the borders of Australia, are there other geographies that you're aware of that could make use of a solution like this?
Yeah, well, our study really did only focus on Australia, as you say, but what I can say is that the benefits from oxygen-based treatment will be greater in countries where land availability is scarce or expensive and where construction costs are high. So we know that. Another factor is energy price. Geographies with high energy costs would have more to gain by transitioning to these more efficient processes. We haven't gone and looked at opportunities in other countries in any detail, but we do know that Scottish Water is already looking at on-site hydrogen production at one of its treatment plants. So these opportunities do exist. Singapore also has good potential in the hydrogen future. Being a major hub for shipping, air transport and industry means that it could capitalise and gain much from the decarbonisation benefits of sustainable hydrogen. Singapore is also very good at tracking and being proactive in adopting new technologies and ways of doing business. So we imagine that the efficiency savings offered by the oxygen-based technologies outlined in our paper would be of interest to them. So yeah, in short, we're sure that this solution could benefit many other geographies, but further analysis is required to identify where offers the greatest potential. There are many people listening to this that would know more about those opportunities, and I'd be really keen for them to reach out to our team and discuss these opportunities with us.
Excellent. Well, it's a fascinating solution, and very innovative to take an existing infrastructure, something like wastewater utilities, and finding a way to like co-locate hydrogen production for a cleaner, more sustainable production, and maximize those facilities. So my hat's off to all of you.
Thanks.
Michelle, Henry, Simon, thank you all very much for joining me today. If you are interested to learn more about what we talked about, there is a white paper that is posted on jacobs.com. It's co-produced with Yarra Valley Water, and you can see all the details there and all the research that the team has put together. So on behalf of Jacobs, thank you so much for joining us, and Simon and Michelle and Henry, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Paul.